In the grand tradition of galactic civilizations with too much time and an unhealthy obsession with paperwork, the hegemony of consolidated worlds had dedicated 3 millennia to the noble art of cataloging which species were most likely to ruin your day. This monumental achievement in bureaucratic overreach was known as the Apex Predator Index, a document so thoroughly researched that it made tax codes look like children's picture books. The index wasn't merely a list. It was a sacred document that determined everything from trade agreements to territorial disputes. Species ranked in the top 10 received automatic military honors and preferential seating at diplomatic functions. Those in the bottom 50 were generally treated like particularly aggressive houseplants, acknowledged but not taken seriously in matters of galactic importance. The methodology behind the rankings was supposedly scientific, involving complex algorithms that measured factors like reaction time, natural weaponry, tactical intelligence, and something called lethality coefficient per unit mass. In practice, it was largely determined by which species had most recently impressed the committee by doing something spectacularly violent in front of witnesses. At the top of this prestigious list sat the Kethran, beetle-like creatures whose idea of diplomacy involved removing limbs in alphabetical order. They'd held the #1 spot for 6 centuries, which was remarkable staying power for a species that considered negotiation a 4-letter word. The hegemony xenobiologists had written entire dissertations on Kethran combat methodology, complete with colorful diagrams showing optimal carapace cracking techniques. The Kethran had earned their position through a combination of natural advantages and cultural dedication to violence that bordered on the artistic. Their exoskeletons could deflect plasma fire, their mandibles could crush titanium, and their approach to conflict resolution made ancient gladiatorial contests look like tea parties. They'd maintained their ranking by regularly challenging other species to formal combat, a practice that had resulted in 17 extinct civilizations and a standing policy that Kethran ambassadors required hazard pay. Second place belonged to the Wrathborn, crystalline entities who communicated through controlled explosions and considered property damage a form of punctuation. Third were the Nethes, who had weaponized their own nervous systems and could literally think their enemies to death. The top 10 was rounded out by various species whose primary qualifications seemed to be an inability to resolve disputes without causing massive casualties. Humans, those recent additions to galactic society, occupied a respectable 15th position. Not bad for a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel by accidentally blowing up their moon. The classification committee had spent considerable time debating humanity's placement, eventually settling on moderately dangerous when sufficiently motivated, which was bureaucrat speak for probably won't eat you unless you really annoy them. The human evaluation had been particularly challenging for the committee. Unlike most species, humans demonstrated wildly inconsistent combat capabilities depending on circumstances, emotional state, and what they'd had for breakfast. Some humans were barely capable of opening food containers without assistance, while others could apparently turn everyday objects into weapons of mass destruction. The committee had ultimately decided to average the results, which explained why humans were sandwiched between the Gloraxians, who were essentially sentient mushrooms with anger management issues, and the Peltari, whose primary weapon was aggressive litigation. This careful ranking system had served the galaxy well, providing a reliable framework for determining who got invited to diplomatic dinners and who got locked in reinforced containment cells. It was a system built on centuries of careful observation, rigorous testing, and absolutely no understanding whatsoever of human psychology. Commander Drex's Hollowfall existed somewhere in the statistical margins of this system, an outlier so far removed from the human baseline that the classification committee had briefly considered creating an entirely new category just for him. At 6'4", with the kind of scars that told stories most people didn't want to hear, Drexis had spent the last decade establishing himself as the galaxy's premier solo operative. His reputation was built on a simple premise: if you needed something impossibly dangerous eliminated, and you didn't care about collateral damage, you called Drexis. The classification committee had actually attempted to study Drexis directly, sending a team of xenobiologists to observe him during what they assumed would be a routine contract. The mission had involved eliminating a nest of shadow mites on a mining colony in the Vegas system, creatures that existed partially in subspace and were considered theoretically impossible to kill. The research team had arrived expecting to document human combat techniques for their quarterly report. Instead, they'd watched Drexus systematically eliminate 37 shadow mites using a combination of conventional weapons, improvised explosives, and what appeared to be interpretive dance. The lead researcher, a meticulous Alterian named Dr. Quexith, had submitted a report that was 90% question marks and concluded with the phrase, "Recommend immediate reclassification of subject as statistical anomaly." The committee had filed the report under unexplained phenomena and quietly increased their insurance premiums. Drexus himself remained blissfully unaware of his effect on galactic bureaucracy. He approached his work with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of turning the impossible into the inevitable. His methods were unconventional, his success rate was mathematically improbable, and his ability to improvise solutions in real time had become something of a legend among the galaxy's military contractors. The man had single-handedly eliminated a void serpent nest on Kepler 42b, which was impressive considering void serpents were supposed to be impossible to locate, let alone kill. He'd also resolved the Andromedan border crisis by walking into a fortified position containing 300 hostiles and walking out 30 minutes later with a signed peace treaty and, inexplicably, a pet rock that supposedly granted wishes. The rock had never granted any wishes, but Drexus kept it anyway, because sometimes the universe had a sense of humor. His client list read like a who's who of galactic troublemakers, from the merchant princes of the Outer Rim to the syndicate of remnant worlds. Each contract had been more impossible than the last, and each successful completion had added another layer to his reputation. The standing joke among mercenaries was that Drexus didn't take contracts, he took suggestions from the universe about what needed to die next. The hegemony's military analysts had spent considerable time trying to understand Drexus's methods. They'd identified patterns in his approach, a preference for overwhelming force, an ability to improvise weapons from seemingly innocent objects, and a talent for identifying the weakest point in any defensive system. But the underlying mechanism remained a mystery. How did one human consistently achieve results that required entire fleets to accomplish? The answer, according to the classified reports, seemed to be a combination of factors that no other species had managed to replicate. Drexus possessed the kind of tactical flexibility that allowed him to adapt to any situation, combined with a psychological profile that suggested he was either completely fearless or entirely insane. The distinction was largely academic, since the practical results were identical. His current contract had arrived through the usual channels, a heavily encrypted message from the Syndicate of Remnant Worlds, offering enough credits to purchase a small moon. The target was a species called the Void Stalkers, creatures that hunted in perfect darkness and had been systematically eliminating mining operations in the Obsidian Reach. Standard procedure dictated sending a full battle fleet, but the Syndicate had a reputation for unconventional solutions and unlimited budgets. The Void Stalkers represented the kind of challenge that most military planners would describe as unsurvivable. They existed in perfect darkness, moved without sound, and killed with the kind of efficiency that suggested either supernatural abilities or really good training. They'd eliminated 3 separate mining operations in the past month, leaving behind scenes that resembled abstract art installations titled, "What Happens When Physics Gets Angry?" The Syndicate's previous attempts to deal with the Stalkers had been instructive in their complete failure. They'd sent conventional military units, who had been systematically eliminated before they could establish a beachhead. They'd tried robotic solutions, which had been torn apart with the kind of precision that suggested the Stalkers found artificial intelligence personally offensive. They'd even attempted negotiation, which had resulted in the diplomatic team being returned in small, carefully labeled containers. What made this contract unusual wasn't the target. Draxis had faced worse odds before. The problem was the partnership clause buried in the fine print, mandating cooperation with one Dr. Phaedra Brightwater, a xenobiologist who specialized in studying species that most people preferred to avoid entirely. Dr. Brightwater, as it turned out, was everything Drexis was not. Where he was direct, she was analytical. Where he relied on instinct, she preferred data. Where he solved problems with overwhelming violence, she approached them with the kind of methodical precision that made accountants weep with joy. She was also, much to Drexis's surprise, the only person he'd ever met who could make a plasma rifle sound boring. The woman had credentials that read like an academic fever dream: triple doctorate in xenobiology, combat psychology, and something called applied lethality theory. Her published works included papers with titles like Neurochemical Triggers in Predator-Prey Dynamics and Mathematical Models of Fear Response in Hostile Environments. She'd spent her career studying the galaxy's most dangerous species, not to eliminate them, but to understand them in ways that made elimination more efficient. What made Phaedra particularly unusual was her approach to fieldwork. While most xenobiologists preferred to study their subjects from the safety of heavily fortified research stations, she had a disturbing tendency to embed herself directly into hostile environments. She'd lived among the Crimson Hive for 6 months, documenting their reproductive cycles while dodging their attempts to use her as an incubator. She'd catalogued the hunting patterns of nebula wraiths by following their migration routes through space in a modified research vessel. Her methodology was either brilliantly innovative or completely insane, depending on your perspective. The Syndicate had recruited her specifically for the Void Stalker contract, after her previous work studying similar apex predators. Her research on the Shadow Collective had resulted in their complete pacification through targeted pheromone manipulation, a solution that had been both elegant and terrifying in its implications. The military applications of her work were classified at levels that required security clearances most governments didn't officially acknowledge. Their first meeting had taken place in a sterile conference room aboard the Syndicate vessel Profit Margin, which was either an admirably honest name or a complete lack of imagination. Phaedra had arrived with 17 data tablets, a holographic projector, and what appeared to be a complete taxonomic breakdown of Voidstalker behavioral patterns. Drexis had arrived with his rifle and a mild hangover. The Voidstalkers employ a sophisticated pack-hunting strategy, Phaedra had explained, manipulating her holographic display to show 3-dimensional tactical formations. They use echolocation combined with electromagnetic sensing to track prey through complete darkness. Their hunting groups typically consist of— "How many rounds does it take to kill one?" Drexis had interrupted. "Depends entirely on shot placement, ammunition type, and the individual specimen's physiological ballpark figure. I suppose 3 to 5 centamass hits with standard plasma charges. Good enough." The conversation had continued in this vein for approximately 20 minutes, with Phaedra providing increasingly detailed analysis and Drexis reducing everything to its most practical application. It was like watching a master chef explain molecular gastronomy to someone who just wanted to know if it was edible. What became clear during their initial briefing was that neither of them was entirely comfortable with the partnership arrangement. Drexis was accustomed to working alone, making decisions based on instinct and experience without having to explain his reasoning to anyone. Phaedra was used to controlled environments where variables could be isolated and studied systematically. Their working styles were fundamentally incompatible, which was either going to result in spectacular failure or something unprecedented. The Obsidian Reach was a system that had apparently been designed by whatever cosmic entity was responsible for making places unpleasant. 6 dead worlds orbited a dying star, creating a region of space where light was more theoretical than practical. The mining operations here extracted rare elements that could only form in conditions of absolute darkness, which made them incredibly valuable and incredibly difficult to defend. The system's unique properties had attracted mining corporations for decades, but the Voidstalkers had made it clear that they considered the entire region their personal hunting preserve. The creatures seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, moving through space with the kind of effortless grace that suggested they were more comfortable in vacuum than most species were on solid ground. Drexis and Phaedra had arrived aboard the Calculated Risk, a modified courier vessel that prioritized speed over comfort. The ship's AI had been programmed with what the manufacturer called aggressive optimization protocols, which meant it would sacrifice anything up to and including life support if it meant arriving 30 seconds faster. Their initial reconnaissance had revealed the scope of the problem. The Voidstalkers weren't just randomly attacking mining operations, they were systematically eliminating human presence in the system using tactics that suggested intelligence, planning, and a disturbing understanding of human psychology. They'd learned to disable life support systems first, forcing personnel into predictable evacuation patterns that made them easy to hunt. Phaedra had spent their first week in system establishing observation posts and collecting behavioral data. She'd deployed sensor networks throughout the asteroid belt, monitoring stalker movement patterns and communication frequencies. Her analysis had revealed that the creatures were operating as a coordinated group, with individual hunting parties reporting to what appeared to be a central command structure. "They're not just animals," she'd explained to Drexis during one of their planning sessions. "They're displaying tactical intelligence that suggests either extensive training or evolutionary adaptation to warfare. Their attack patterns are optimized for maximum psychological impact, not just lethality." Drexis had found this information moderately interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to his preferred approach. "So we find their base and eliminate it. It's not that simple. They've dispersed their population across multiple locations, creating redundant command structures. Eliminating one nest just causes the others to adapt and become more aggressive. We need to understand their behavioral triggers before we can develop an effective strategy." This had led to their first major disagreement about methodology. Drexis favored the direct approach. Identify the biggest concentration of stalkers and eliminate them with overwhelming force. Phaedra preferred a more systematic approach, studying their patterns and developing targeted interventions that would disrupt their entire social structure. Their first encounter with the Voidstalkers had occurred during what was supposed to be a routine patrol of the outer mining platforms. The creatures had materialized from the darkness like physics-defying nightmares, moving with a kind of coordinated precision that suggested either advanced intelligence or really good choreography. Drexis had responded with his usual approach: identify the biggest threat and eliminate it as loudly as possible, but something had changed in his approach. Instead of charging headfirst into the engagement, he'd found himself unconsciously positioning himself to take advantage of Phaedra's analytical capabilities. She'd been feeding him real-time tactical data, identifying weak points in the stalker's formation and predicting their movement patterns with an accuracy that bordered on precognition. The battle had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, during which time Drexis had demonstrated why the hegemony's classification system occasionally undersold human capabilities. He'd moved through the engagement with the kind of fluid brutality that made violence look like an art form, eliminating targets with an efficiency that would have impressed the Kithran. But something had been different. Phaedra, instead of staying safely in the rear as any sensible scientist would, had been feeding him tactical information in real time. She had identified weak points in the stalker's formation, predicted their movement patterns, and somehow calculated optimal firing solutions faster than his targeting computer. "Behind you, 45 degrees targeting your left flank," she'd called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Drexis had spun and fired without hesitation, trusting her analysis completely. The shot had taken down a stalker that had been moments away from removing his head from his shoulders. "How did you—" "Pattern recognition. They're using a modified pincer movement, but they're compensating for your previous positioning. If you move 3 meters to your right, they'll have to reorganize their attack formation, giving us approximately 12 seconds to—" Got it." The engagement had ended with 16 dead Voidstalkers, and a growing realization that their partnership might be more effective than either of them had anticipated. Phaedra's scientific approach didn't just complement Drexis's combat skills, it amplified them in ways that made the mathematical concept of synergy look like amateur hour. Over the following weeks, their effectiveness had increased exponentially. Phaedra would analyze the stalker's behavioral patterns, identifying their weaknesses and predicting their tactics. Drexus would implement her strategies with the kind of precision that made military textbooks obsolete. Together, they'd begun systematically eliminating the Void Stalker presence in the Obsidian Reach with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The turning point had come when Phaedra had proposed a fundamental shift in their approach. Instead of treating the stalkers as individual threats to be eliminated, she suggested they target the psychological foundations of their pack behavior. Her research had revealed that the creature's coordination depended on a complex system of pheromone communication that could be disrupted through targeted environmental manipulation. They're using chemical signals to coordinate their attacks, she'd explained, gesturing to her latest analysis. If we can introduce synthetic pheromones that mimic their distress signals, we can trigger mass confusion in their ranks. They'll perceive phantom threats everywhere and lose their ability to coordinate effectively. Drexus had been skeptical of the plan initially. His experience had taught him that when something needed to die, the most efficient approach was usually the most direct one. But Phaedra's psychological warfare approach had proven devastatingly effective during their test runs, causing entire stalker hunting packs to turn on each other in frenzied paranoia. The implementation of their new strategy had required a level of coordination that neither of them had anticipated. Phaedra would deploy her pheromone dispensers at strategic locations throughout the asteroid belt, creating zones of manufactured confusion among the stalker population. Drexus would then move through these zones, eliminating the disoriented creatures with the kind of systematic efficiency that made the process look almost routine. But the stalkers had proven more adaptable than expected. After several successful operations, they'd begun to develop countermeasures, adapting their communication methods and developing resistance to the synthetic pheromones. Their response had been swift and coordinated, suggesting a level of intelligence that exceeded Phaedra's initial assessments. The breakthrough had come during their assault on the stalker's primary nest, a structure built into the hollow core of a dead planetoid. The creatures had adapted to their previous tactics, implementing countermeasures that should have made the mission impossible. But Phaedra had developed a new approach. Instead of fighting the stalker's natural advantages, she'd found a way to turn them against each other. They're using electromagnetic pulses to coordinate their attacks, she'd explained, gesturing to her latest analysis. If we can disrupt their communication network at precisely the right moment, they'll default to individual hunting patterns. Their pack coordination will collapse, but more importantly, they'll begin competing with each other for territory and resources. And then we introduce a secondary disruption that mimics the electromagnetic signature of their primary food source. They'll begin hunting each other, believing they're tracking prey. Their own predatory instincts will become their weakness. The plan was elegant in its complexity, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. Phaedra would need to monitor the stalker's communication networks in real time, identifying the optimal moments to introduce each phase of the disruption. Drexus would move through the chaos, eliminating key targets while the creatures were distracted by their artificially induced territorial conflicts. The final battle had been less a fight than a carefully orchestrated psychological breakdown. Phaedra had guided Drexus through the nest's twisted corridors, her real-time analysis turning him into something that transcended traditional combat effectiveness. She'd mapped the stalkers' confusion patterns, predicting their responses to each disruption and directing Drexus to exploit their momentary vulnerabilities. The creatures had fallen not to superior firepower, but to their own instincts turned against them. They'd torn each other apart in their confusion, leaving Drexus to eliminate the survivors with the kind of clinical efficiency that made the entire operation look like a training exercise. The psychological warfare had been so effective that many of the stalkers had eliminated themselves, saving Drexus the ammunition. When the last Void Stalker had fallen, the silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either revelation or massive explosions. Drexus had stood amid the carnage, his rifle still smoking, while Phaedra had calmly updated her field notes, as if documenting the results of a particularly interesting experiment. Drexus had paused, searching for words that didn't exist in any language he knew. Efficient, Phaedra had supplied helpfully. I was going to say terrifying. BS2, the mission's completion had sent ripples through the galactic community that were still being felt months later. The Hegemony's classification committee had spent weeks trying to understand how two humans had accomplished what should have required a full military fleet. Their initial reports had focused on equipment advantages and tactical innovations, but the real explanation was far more unsettling. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came from the insurance industry. Lloyd's of the Galaxy, the premier provider of mercenary coverage, had quietly begun offering human partnership policies at rates that suggested they were either very confident or very desperate. The actuarial tables had been completely rewritten after a series of impossible contracts had been completed by human pairs with casualty rates that defied statistical probability. The military contractors had been the next to notice. Requests for human teams had increased by 300%, with clients specifically requesting partnerships rather than individual operators. The price for human mercenary services had tripled overnight, not because humans had become more expensive, but because they'd become exponentially more effective when properly paired. The Kethran military hierarchy had been forced to acknowledge that their understanding of human combat capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. Their war colleges had begun studying human partnership dynamics with the kind of desperate intensity usually reserved for impending extinction events. The sight of elite Kethran warriors frantically taking notes on human cooperation had become a source of considerable amusement throughout the galaxy, but the real revelation had come from the xenobiological research community. Dr. Phaedra's post-mission analysis had identified the specific mechanisms that made human partnerships so devastatingly effective. Her findings had been classified at the highest levels by 17 different governments, but the basic principles had leaked into the academic community through carefully worded research papers. The problem wasn't that humans were individually dangerous. The classification system had accounted for that. The problem was that human partnerships created multiplicative effects that broke the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire ranking system. Drex's alone had been a formidable opponent. With Phaedra's analytical support, he'd become something that transcended traditional combat categories entirely. The mathematical implications had been staggering. Human combat effectiveness didn't just double when they worked in pairs, it increased exponentially based on the compatibility of their skill sets. A soldier paired with a scientist could achieve results that exceeded their individual capabilities by factors of 10 or more. An engineer paired with a pilot could accomplish missions that entire fleets couldn't complete. The potential combinations were virtually limitless. The Hegemony's research division had attempted to replicate these results with other species, pairing Kethran warriors with Altarian analysts, combining Wrathborn demolitions experts with Nethi's tactical specialists. Every attempt had failed spectacularly, usually resulting in the test subjects attempting to eliminate each other before the experiment could be completed. The unique psychology that made human partnerships so effective appeared to be species-specific. Humans possessed an unusual combination of traits: individual competence paired with cooperative instincts, competitive drive balanced by collaborative intelligence. Other species were either too individualistic to work effectively together or too collective to maintain individual initiative. Other human partnerships had begun emerging across the galaxy, each one demonstrating the same unsettling pattern. Scientists paired with soldiers, engineers paired with pilots, doctors paired with demolitions experts. Every combination seemed to produce results that were greater than the sum of their parts. The mathematical implications were keeping xenobiologists awake at night. The emergence of human partnership culture had created a new paradigm in galactic affairs. Governments that had previously viewed humans as moderately useful auxiliaries were now actively recruiting human teams for their most critical operations. The diplomatic implications were staggering. Humans had gone from being minor players in galactic politics to being actively courted by major powers. The economic impact had been equally dramatic. Human mercenary companies had reorganized their entire business models around partnership principles. Solo operators like Drexis had become obsolete overnight, replaced by carefully matched teams that could command premium rates for impossible contracts. The galaxy's most dangerous jobs were being completed by human pairs, with success rates that made conventional military units look like amateur enthusiasts. The Kethran, those proud holders of the #1 spot, had requested a formal review of their classification status. It was the first time in 6 centuries that they'd shown anything resembling uncertainty, and the sight of worried beetle creatures frantically updating their threat assessments had become a source of considerable amusement throughout the galaxy. The cultural impact had been perhaps the most significant. Human partnership dynamics had begun influencing other species' approaches to cooperation and conflict resolution. The hegemony had established a new department dedicated to studying human social structures, staffed by researchers who approached their work with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The hegemony's classification committee had been forced to acknowledge that their entire system was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. They'd been measuring humans as individual predators, when the species' true strength lay in their ability to form partnerships that defied conventional analysis. It was like trying to understand a symphony by examining individual notes. Dr. Phaedra Brightwater had continued her research, now focusing on the psychological mechanisms that made human partnerships so effective. Her latest paper, titled Synergistic Combat Applications in Human Pair Bonding, had been classified at the highest security levels by 7 different governments. The implications of her findings had created a new field of study that combined xenobiology with strategic planning. Commandant Drex's Hollowfall had continued accepting contracts, though now he exclusively worked in partnership arrangements. His reputation had evolved from impossibly dangerous individual to catalyst for multiplicative combat effectiveness, which was a phrase that had never appeared in any military manual but was rapidly becoming common usage. The galaxy's most impossible contracts were now being bid on by human partnerships that treated the impossible as merely challenging. The galaxy had learned, somewhat belatedly, that humans weren't just apex predators. They were apex predators who had figured out how to amplify their effectiveness through strategic partnerships, creating combat combinations that redefined what it meant to be dangerous. It was a revelation that had forced every major government to reconsider their assumptions about human capabilities, and more importantly, their policies regarding human immigration. The hegemony's latest classification report had included a new category, synergistic apex predators, human pair bonding variant. The description was brief and to the point. Approach with extreme caution. Do not underestimate. Recommend immediate diplomatic resolution of conflicts. It was, the committee had noted with characteristic understatement, a significant revision to their previous assessments. The galaxy's understanding of human nature had been fundamentally altered by the realization that an apex predator was deadly alone, but with the right partner, it became something far more dangerous. A storm that could reshape the very concept of what it meant to be powerful, and in the sterile conference rooms where bureaucrats continued their endless work of categorizing and classifying, the phrase human partnership had become synonymous with recalculate everything. It was a development that would have been amusing if it weren't so absolutely terrifying.